right, good morning, everyone. We're going to be tackling now Ruth 3 and 4, and this is just by way of review. Some of the themes and various things we're going to talk about along the way. Not necessarily all today, but these are some of the, what I call storylines that we want to consider as we go through it. I mean, as I pointed out last week, the book of Ruth is interesting because Ruth and Naomi and Boaz form an interesting triangle, if you will. All three are looking out for each other, but all three have a very similar problem in that they are trying to have a lineage. And that lineage, of course, is going to come through the levirate law, which we'll talk about certainly today, but also certainly going forward. And so you can see some things on there. Like I said, not everything that are on that list will be here today, but we do want to look at Ruth chapter 3, and we don't really have to go very far for our first lesson. So let me read that, verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said unto her, My daughter, which is Ruth, shall I not seek rest for thee, that it may be well with thee? Now, this is interesting because I'm both on a spiritual level, but also on a practical level of what Naomi is saying here. She's saying, number one, and of course we understand the word rest from a New Testament perspective when it says that there are rest for the believers, a time of sitting down and being with the Lord, who is our husband in that case. There is, of course, a concern for Ruth. One of the concerns, and by the way, it's a concern even in today's world, is that Ruth every day is getting up to glean the fields, and she's doing physical labor. And you can only do that for so long. I mean, it may sound appealing at first in some jobs, for instance, but here was a woman, a younger woman, I'm going to assume 25 years old, somewhere in that range. And every day she's going to get up and glean the field and come back to Naomi to provide food. But of course, Naomi realizes this is not an easy job, and it's going to wear her out at some point. At some point, she's going to get tired. At some point, in fact, they say in some fields, it ages you, for instance, okay? I'll use an example. I guess in the world there's a lot of them. Let's take a football player as an example. When he goes out to a game, he's physically trying to help the team win the game. Well, there's a penalty on him because the body wears out, it gets injured. A lot of these guys, by the way, you see on the field, they're not 100% healthy. They're injured out there, but they're out there playing anyway. And so I think the average lifespan of an NFL player is about 3 years. And then they're done. Maybe a little longer in other sports and things like that. But 3 years is not very long. And of course, what they come out as after those 3 years of being hit all over the place is they're actually older men. They're not, they may be 25 or 30 years old after they come out of the league, but they don't look 25 or 30. They've been pushed around a lot and things like that and gotten beaten down. And so this is also part of the penalty that was put on Adam, was it not? By the sweat of thy brow, you will, gather your food. Well, this is the same problem Ruth and Naomi are facing. Ruth in particular, because she's the one going out there every day to try to glean the fields and try to bring in food. It's not hard, or not a hard thing to do very long. I mean, that can be done very long. And so we see here in the very next verse, and on the screen here as well, Naomi says, well, the solution to this is to find you a husband, a protector, a provider. And if you go back, and I should have brought the book today, the Christadelphian expositor does a really good job of this, by pointing out that the solution, not just for these women, for women in general in Israel, might even say today, but we'll talk about that in a moment, was to find someone they could marry, that the husband would be the provider. They would go out and get in the fields and do various jobs and whatever, and come home and feed the family. And the job of the wife then was to take care of the home, raise the children, all very traditional stuff. And I would say that probably in the last 60 years or so, this kind of gets flipped around on its head, where you see a lot of things, both in social media and elsewhere, where women say, men too, but women will say, I don't need a man. I don't need a husband. I can do it myself. I can make an income all by myself, sometimes even more than the man could. I can do it. I'm strong. I can handle it. But again, that's an untraditional way, not what the Bible talks about in terms of, if you think of marriage as a type of the Lord Jesus and us, Jesus our husband, and we are the bride, we're looking for a rest from our husband in that regard, because he's going to take care of us. He's going to provide everything. And our role, of course, in faith is to support what he does. We're in a supportive role in the kingdom. And so if the Lord says in the kingdom, I want you to go do this or that or whatever, of course we're going to go do that. We're part of the supporting what the Lord's mission is in setting up the kingdom and ruling over it. We are not, by the way, rulers. There's only one king. There's only one king. We don't say we're all king. That verse in Revelation always, where it says we shall be kings and priests, which really, if you look at the translation, means kingdom of priests. Not that we're king. There's only one king. There's only one master, and that's the Lord. So anyway, back to our story here. Naomi says, well, I've got to fix this. I got to figure out a solution for Ruth. And we should also take note that that's our job, to look out for the needs of each other, to see how we can lift the burden off someone else. And that takes some work. It means that you have to figure out a solution and look for an answer. So here we have the challenges, if you will, facing Naomi. And the first challenge is the inheritance. Who is going to take the inheritance from Elimelech? So the first consideration, identify the kinsmen. Who are the possibilities here? We'll see, by the way, there's only two possibilities, it appears, that Naomi had. Next problem or challenge, Ruth's a Moabite. That's a big challenge. It's not that she's a Jewish widow. You might have a little bit more possibilities here, but being a Moabite, as we've talked about before, not a real starter, let's say, for a lot of young men in Israel. They're not necessarily interested in the Moabites because, of course, the lineage by which they came through Lot. You see here, and we'll explore this more, this idea of the Abrahamic covenant versus the law of Moses. This is really interesting because they're going to have to weigh which law or covenant to follow. And this gets picked up, of course, very strongly in the New Testament. This idea of which law, which way do we follow? Now, I'll put a little aside note here. I will suggest to you, and you can decide amongst yourselves, as it were, that I can imagine that the Lord Jesus, even at age 12, when the priest said, why don't you come and stay with us and we'll raise you and teach you and the law and all that. And of course it says he chose to go back with Mary and Joseph. I think Jesus, even at a young age, could see this tension between the Abrahamic covenant and the law of Moses. When they were asking questions, they were asking questions of the Mosaic law. But Jesus could see down the road, I would think, that it was the Abrahamic covenant he was going to tell them was above this. And of course, as we're going to see, the scribes and Pharisees weren't going to go along with that because Moses was their person, as it were. And Jesus is going to tell them, no, Abraham's your person. That's a big problem. And it's also a problem here a little bit. Talk a little bit about the nearer kinsman. There is another kinsman in play. We'll We'll look at that in a little bit. And the other question really comes down to is, how long should Naomi wait to kind of push this issue of the levirate marriage? Now, Boaz appears to be, at least from what she can tell, it appears that he's somewhat interested in Ruth. He's obviously taking special care of her in the fields, probably because, again, of Naomi. But they're in the field, and so we see that Boaz is interested, if you will. At least that's what Naomi perceives. But how long should she sit back and wait? Because if you look at some of the texts here, there's still a period of time between what happens with Ruth and Boaz in terms of the levirate proposal, we'll call it. Maybe 2 or 3 months, or 2 or 3 weeks, a month. How long should Naomi wait for someone to make a move here? Boaz or the near kinsman. In other words, and even in our society today, generally speaking, women don't propose marriage to the husband. Normally the other way around. Well, in this case, what Naomi, and I mentioned Ruth too, what they're waiting on is for one of these kinsmen to come forward and say, okay, I know about this marriage law here, so I got to tackle this issue. But they don't seem to come at it right away. It could be that, and again, we're speculating here, it could be that Boaz says, well, I'm not the primary kinsman, so I'm going to wait and see what he does, the other kinsman does. I'm not going to say anything or do anything. And so this question of forcing the issue, it's something to think about in our own lives. How long do we wait to resolve an issue? Our tendency is to sit back and say, well, something will happen here. I'm sure something good will happen, we hope. But how long do we wait before we say, we got to move this thing along. We got to do things. And that's what Naomi is going to do here. She's thinking this through, and she is, being a Jewish woman, she knows the law. She knows what's involved here. She's going to be doing her homework, we're going to see, in trying to make this issue move forward. In other words, getting Ruth a husband so that there might be a lineage continued through Elimelech and through the tribe of Judah. So here on this slide, we see that it isn't just her concern about temporary things like working in the fields. What's the long-term concern? Like, the old story of give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man how to fish, and he does it for a lifetime. This idea of a long-term outlook. We look at the short term and say, how do I fix this problem? But what's the long term? It's the thing I used to hear in the business community is you make a decision and then the next tagline is, and then what? So you do this, and then what? Where do you go? What do you do next? Is that the end result? So that's a concern here as well. Now, the word rest, and you can see the Hebrew with there. I'm not going to attempt to even say what it is. It means place of rest, protection, honor, security. And if you go back to Ruth chapter 1 at verse 9, why don't we get a reader for that? Ruth chapter 1 at verse 9. So someone wants to raise it. Oh, we got someone, okay.
Ruth 1:9. The Lord grant you that you may find a home, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept.
Notice she says to her two daughter-in-laws, that the Lord grant you that you might find rest. And what would that rest be? It would be in a marriage. She says to them, it's unlikely you're going to have children, you're going to have a husband in Israel. But your rest is finding a spouse. And that's, again, Deuteronomy 12:9, for you're not as yet come to the rest, the inheritance of which is the Lord's, which he's going to give us. In Hebrews, we have Paul saying, let us labor, therefore, to enter into that rest. And that rest is a marriage with the Lord as our husband and we as the bride in that sense. And of course, the Sabbath day was intended to reflect this idea of a rest for people. Okay, and that was right after the marriage law. That was right after Adam and Eve get married. Then we have a day of rest. That kind of foreshadows what this is all about. And so Naomi sits down and says, how can I accomplish this? That's kind of dangerous, because maybe we want to say, how does the Lord accomplish this? That's not enough for us to sit back and say, well, the Lord will take care of it. Well, yeah, the Lord has all this power. He'll take care of my issue. He knows. But this implies that we have to make some sort of an effort. We can't just sit back and go, well, the Lord will provide me food. I'll just sit out here. I'm sure like manna will come down from the sky, or quails will show up, or whatever. It's not, our lives, the Lord expects us to do something. And that's what Naomi is taking control here. Says, I've got to do something. I got to figure this out. Just Ruth isn't quite as familiar with the ways of Israel, but I am. And she's got a plan. And it's quite interesting as we go through this. So stop me along the way if you've got questions or comments you want to make. But think about the issue she has. I can try to find her a partner, someone to marry, but will they even have a son? That's out of her control. That's the Lord's decision then. They could have daughters, no sons. So again, there's only so much that Naomi can do, and then she has to trust on the Lord. That's what we have to do. We can only do so much, and then the Lord has to take over. We don't necessarily like that. We think, I've read somewhere, if you ever read the book, what is it? Men are from Venus and women are from Mars, or the other way around. I forget how that goes. But they say, the old story there, it comes out that they say that if your spouse comes to you and explains what looks like a problem, you immediately start offering solutions, and she doesn't want a solution. She just wants you to listen to the problem. Well, in this case, Naomi's taking that role. So I got a problem. I got to figure this out. It's on me to do it, because apparently Boaz isn't doing anything. Apparently the nearer kinsman isn't doing anything. I got to do something.
Two things that you're bringing up make me think of. One, it's a really fine line, isn't it, for Naomi to be self-sufficient, to problem solve, and then still be giving it to God. That would be a hard line to walk. I think that's hard for all of us sometimes. We feel like we got to go out there and do the things, make it happen, hustle. But there's only so far that she can go without kind of overstepping her bounds. So I'm curious your thoughts on that. And also, how long would have been the time period for mourning? Like, if Ruth, is she still in mourning for her husband that passed?
So the question of mourning here, if you look at David and Bathsheba, let's use when Uriah died, it was 7 days. Because he says after 7 days, mourning is done. Now, in this case, though, it's a little different, because these husbands have already passed away a while, we presume, at least a while ago. So that, yes, there was mourning, but it wasn't like it just happened. Elimelech dies first, and then the sons die. They're in Moab for 10 years. Somewhere along the way, they pass away. The period of mourning would have been there. In fact, it's already implied they've already done the mourning, because when Naomi says to her daughter-in-laws, go find a husband now. The mourning part may have been done. They're going to go find amongst their people. And of course, we know the rest of that. Here's the first one of the problems that we talked about. There in Deuteronomy 23, the NIV says in verse 3, no Ammonite or Moabite or any of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, even down to the 10th generation. And this is well known. This is starting from Lot's day, so it'd be around Abraham's time. And God said, you're cursed for this. So the Ammonites and the Moabites were the two daughters of Lot and produced children. We don't want to go through the whole messy story here. But the Lord said, that's what's going to happen. And by the way, now some commentators will say, where it says, nor any of his descendants, referring to the men, would enter into the assembly of the Lord, as though there was some maybe room for the women. It's kind of vague, but basically in Israel, nobody wanted to be with a Moabite or marry an Ammonite. Not a good thing. So again, you got to stop and think like Naomi and say, how do I overcome that? And maybe Boaz is reluctant because she is a Moabite. I mean, that could have entered her mind. Boaz is taking care of her, of course, and because of me, maybe. But he's like, I don't know, Moabite's not going to look real good on the resume for Israel, right? I don't think that the people around me are going to think it's a great idea, especially because of this verse. Yeah, we're getting to that. Yeah, we're going to get to that. So here is the ancestry, the lineage, if you will. And if you start from Abraham and then Isaac, and of course down to Judah, Judah is in this case our concern, you can see that we go Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then we go from Jacob to Judah. But if you count these generations, you get to the 10th generation at Boaz. I won't do the counting for you, I'll let you do the counting, but you get down to Boaz. He is the 10th generation. So the question is there whether or not, from Naomi's standpoint, assuming, by the way, I think most, certainly in their own family line, knew the lineage. Lineage is a big deal in Israel, okay? I mean, they know it. But you can count 10 generations here, and of course, you can see that she might argue that and say, look, what is said here in Deuteronomy doesn't apply now. The 10th generation's over. You can marry a Moabite. And you're going to see that Israel itself in their genealogies here did some very, let's say, unusual things. Okay? So she's got to think this through and says, the 10 generation thing, I think I can get around. And by the way, I'm sure Boaz could figure that out too, that this is the 10th generation.
What's the basis for saying the generations start with Lot or Ammon or Moab? Is it because, well, it must be because Ruth is the 10th or 11th? Because the storyline in Deuteronomy 23 would suggest it's from the time of Balaam.
Yeah, well, I take that because the Ammonites and the Moabites came as a result of the situation with Lot, okay? And God cursed this and said, I'm not going to put up with this, okay? Again, we can go, I don't want to spend a lot of time, but you can realize that when Lot was leaving the city, I suggest to you what the angels are saying is go back to Abraham, and they said, and Lot said, nah, not so much. I want to go down to that city over there. And the angel said, okay. Now the daughters of Lot could have still married, from the tribe or the family of Abraham. That would have been okay. Of course, they thought, no, they're going to take matters into their own hand. That's why that's kind of dangerous, by the way. Take matters in your own hand. So I interpret that to mean that he's starting with the very beginning of the Ammonites and Moabites and going 10 generations down, and of course Lot, contemporary with Abraham, working their way down through the lineage. Now again, you'll get commentators that say this only refers to the males, not to the females, but I would say it's still applicable. Now, first we got to do some disclaimers on this next one. And the disclaimer is that this comes from the Babylonian Talmud, and so it's not inspired word, okay? I mean, some of this you can see here does come from Matthew's account, for instance. And it was kind of hard to find this, by the way. Josephus in his writings will, and I wasn't aware of this, will look at the Talmud, but they also look at Roman historians as well, in terms of his writings. But here we look at the tribe starting from Judah on. So we have Nahshon, and he is said here, according to this lineage, has 4 sons. Over to the far right is Salmon, who's going to give birth to Boaz. And who again was Salmon married to? Who was his wife? Rahab. Okay? So right there you see a little bit of a breaking point starting here. But anyway, you have Boaz. Elimelech, now here's where the chart gets kind of interesting. The lineage suggests that one of the sons of Nahshon had a daughter named Naomi, and that Elimelech married Naomi, which would have been his niece. And the reason he would do that is to keep the family lineage together. So it would all be in the same family line. Now, that's not proven here. I'm just giving you what the Talmud would say, is that Naomi would marry Elimelech. And of course, they would have sons there, as we've talked about. That would make unknown son number 1 the father of Naomi, also the brother of Elimelech. The third person there that says Ploni Almoni is not actually a name. It just means unknown person. That's kind of a marker in the lineage. When they don't know the name, they put this Ploni Almoni that says, we don't know who it is. We know they were there, but we don't know their names. So we can see from this chart, if we accept it, there were only 2 possibilities it would appear, of a near kinsman. Boaz knows that he is, okay? And by the way, you can see Boaz and Naomi, if you want to draw kind of an imaginary line there, roughly about the same age. They were older. We had suggested before 45, 50 years old. They were older. But the other person that we don't know is probably that third person over, next to Shalman. That person would have been an older person, even older than Boaz. And so if that's true, you have Boaz at 45 to 50, but you have this other nearer kinsman, maybe closer to 70 or 75 years old, somewhere in that range. Not that 70 is old, by the way. Just want you to be aware of it. I think that's an important thing to note. But you're going to see later that when this elder near kinsman is going to speak, you can see that he's pretty well established in terms of his marriage, his inheritance, and all the others. So those are your possibilities. And so if you're Naomi and you're considering this, and you want to keep it in the family line, that's important. You don't want Ruth marrying in some other Jewish line. You want to keep it in the line of Judah, all right? She's got 2 possibilities here. Now, does she know, in this case, does she know her uncle? I'm sure she does. Been a number of years, but it's her uncle. All these other 3 are her uncles. So you would think, we have no record of this, you would think that she might approach him and say, hey, levirate law here of marriage is in effect, and that's what Boaz eventually is going to do on his own. But she knows, or at least she thinks she knows, that Boaz is interested. Let's say that. So just keep that in mind. No guarantees on this chart, but it is an interesting idea. So if you're Naomi, you're saying, well, where can I find an example of my situation? And that's found in the story of Tamar. This thing gets kind of ugly, by the way, so just stay with me a little bit here. And we're not going to, let me see if I have. So Tamar had faces kind of a similar situation, somewhat, to what Ruth and Naomi are facing. Tamar is a Canaanite. By the way, Judah himself married a Canaanite. You think about that. Wasn't a pure Jewish line here. You're starting to marry Canaanites, which they were told, of course, when they went in the land, kill all the Canaanites, and that's not what Joshua did. But Judah marries Shua, and they have children. Now Tamar marries one of the firstborns of Judah. And they have no sons, and he does wickedly, and it says God took him, got rid of him. I once heard a talk many years ago, a long time ago, brothers saying that the world is like a chessboard, and whenever the Lord wants to remove a piece, he can do that. I don't like that. Off the board you go. So Tamar marries no children. So she goes to Judah and says, I need another husband. And he says, I have another one, and it's Onan. But Onan, now I'm going to put this delicately, you can go read the account, doesn't consummate the marriage. Let's say that, okay? And she's unhappy with this solution. Doesn't matter, the Lord takes him off the scene too. So Judah has a third son. And Judah says to Tamar, don't worry, when this son gets a little older, I'll give him to you. So stay in my house. When he gets a little older, that's your new husband. Except she figures out that's not what his plan is at all. He's not interested anymore in Tamar with his third son. And Tamar figures that out. Oh, you're really not going to give me this person, right? Of course, you have the other issue, maybe, of Tamar being older than the third son. So what does Tamar do? This is where Naomi knows this story, and here's how this goes. Tamar says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to dress up like a prostitute and go down to a city that I know that Judah is going to. And Judah loses his wife, Shua, and comes down to the city and sees this prostitute and goes into her. And she says, who was actually Tamar, what will you give me if you lie down with me? He goes, I'll give you a goat. I don't have it with me, but I'll give you a goat. And she says, well, what kind of things are you going to give me to prove, that I can enforce this later? And he gives, of course, a signet and a mantle. And so Tamar gets pregnant by Judah. Fast forward about 3 months, she's still in Judah's household. The servants and kinsmen come over to Judah and say, hey, Tamar's with child. Obviously, she committed some sort of an adulterous act. You got to, basically said, you got to kill her. That's not appropriate. And so when Judah comes to Tamar and says, hey, what's this thing with the child? She produces the items that he gave her. And he said, oh, this is a problem. And he says, you're more righteous than I am, aren't you? And she was. And so Tamar, by the way, Tamar shows up in Matthew 1. We have to assume that Tamar's character is fairly a good one, a person of faith. She's determined, even though she's a Canaanite, she's determined that the levirate law will take place. This levirate law was a custom even before the law of Moses. This wasn't just a Mosaic thing. It had been in Israel for quite some time. It was a way to keep families going. You didn't want to have widows, and who's going to take care of them? So you have to have some sort of a way to do that. So anyway, if you're Naomi and you're reading this story or thinking of the story about Tamar, she says, well, Tamar really kind of pressed the issue, didn't she? She didn't exactly go to Judah and say, hey, I'm still waiting for that son, because it's not doing anything. They're not making any progress. And that's what Naomi's problem is at the moment. There's no progress being made here on getting Ruth a wife. What will she do? Now, this is not what she's going to suggest to Ruth. But what she can take from the story of Tamar is that it was okay to make the issue move along, not to sit back and wait. Tamar did this, and she's a Canaanite. In fact, like I said, the Jewish line, we'll talk later about, well, we have already talked about Rahab, and Bathsheba comes into this as well as the women in Matthew 1. We may have mentioned it before, I'll mention it again. You'll notice that Salmon or Shalman, however you want to say it, the first time we know his name of being married to Rahab is in Matthew 1. It's not recorded in any of the Old Testament. And why is that? Well, like I said, it's not a really high point in Israel's lineage. You don't necessarily go around bragging about that, do you? Oh yeah, my son, he married a harlot, at Jericho, and I'm really proud of that. Really? You think Israel was proud of that a harlot? And by the way, she's the only woman that gets mentioned again in the New Testament, talking about her faith. So she could look at that and say, Rahab also, by the way, was a woman of faith, and she was a Canaanite. So Naomi is going to try to force the issue now. Naomi says, I'm going to like stir some stuff up here, and I'm going to make these two kinsmen make a decision here. They're not going to be able to sit back and wait it out, so to speak. I'm going to move this along. Again, this is a fine line. This is not an easy decision of what to do. But Tamar is before the law of Moses. She's part of the Abrahamic covenant, if you will. She's not under the Mosaic. And that's where we start getting our tension between the Abrahamic covenant and the law of Moses. You can just, maybe get a reader for it. You want to have a reader read that in Deuteronomy 25.
When brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as a wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her.
This is prescribed by Moses. This is what you do, okay? She could quote that law, so could Boaz. They could all quote that law. And that's what she had. And notice here, you're going to keep it in the family line. And here again in Deuteronomy again, why don't we get another reader? Oh, okay, we have comments staying here. Sorry.
Boaz may have been just waiting for the other fellow. He wasn't first in line. So he, like you said, had an interest in Ruth, but it was his place to just say, okay, I'll marry her.
Yeah, we don't know, right? It's just, we don't know the minds of these people directly, okay? Do we have a reader for this?
And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel.
So here was the idea of continuing the lineage on, okay? And then there was a clause about what would happen if the man didn't want to marry that person. One more reader, maybe?
But if the man does not want to marry his brother's widow, she is to go to the elders at the city gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to preserve his brother's name in Israel. He is not willing to perform the duty of a brother-in-law for me.
Okay, so now does Naomi want to go down this road? Does Naomi say, well, this isn't working, so I'm going to go, just like it says here in Deuteronomy, I'm going to go to the elders of the gate and say, hey, my brother-in-law or the closest kinsman, my husband's brother, is not fulfilling the law, and I want you to enforce this law. So there's Naomi's problem right there. Should she go forward and force it amongst the elders of the city and say, he, whoever he is the one that's supposed to marry me? We're going to leave it off right there because we're going to see these are just some of the considerations that are facing us, and Naomi too, of how far she's going to go to get a wife for Ruth. Or, I'm sorry, a husband for Ruth. Let's stop right there.